The mall was busy that evening. People were doing what they always did, shuffling through shops, chatting with their families, sipping coffee, and going about their lives like the world was safe. But it wasn't. Not for everyone. On the third floor of Daring Mall, tucked away in an apartment above the shops, there was a man beating a woman. It wasn't the kind of beating that stopped after a few slaps. No, this was the kind of beating that left marks. Bruises that didn't fade easily. Words that cut deeper than any knife. And for a young girl named Amara, it was a nightmare she couldn't escape. She had heard it all before. The shouting, the slamming, the glass breaking. It wasn't new. But tonight it felt different. Tonight, she was terrified. Terrified because she heard her mother scream louder than she ever had before. Save her. Please, somebody save her. He's beating my mom. Amara's tiny voice echoed through the nearly empty parking lot, her voice breaking with desperation as she ran barefoot across the cold concrete. Her tiny frame was shaky with fear, but she had no choice. She didn't even know why she ran to the Korean Mafia boss. She didn't know his name, but everyone in the mall did. His men, standing near their black sedans, looked like statues. Perfect, controlled, watching everything without ever speaking. But she didn't care about them. She needed help. And she needed it now. The moment she saw him, standing like a god among men, she ran straight to him. Straight to the man everyone feared. The man who ruled the underground with an iron fist. Chairman Kong Min-jae. Her little fists clenched around his expensive suit as she collapsed into his legs. He's beating my mum. Please, he won't stop. He locked the door. Amara sobbed, barely able to catch her breath. Min-jae looked down at the tiny figure at his feet. Her small hands were clinging to his black suit, her face streaked with dirt and tears. For a moment, his usually cold expression softened, but only for a second. His eyes scanned the parking lot, his men moving instinctively to surround him. The world around him shifted. The quiet tension that followed him wherever he went was thick now. The people in the mall, who just a second ago had been oblivious, were now watching. The woman, the little girl, and the mafia boss in front of them. It wasn't a scene anyone was prepared for. But Min-jae was no stranger to control. It was the only thing he knew. Who is he? Min-jae asked softly, his voice cold, calculated. Who's the man who's putting his hands on a woman in front of her child? Amara's voice trembled as she replied, My mom's boyfriend. He's on the third floor. He's going to kill her if I don't get help. Please. Min-jae didn't flinch. He didn't speak to anyone else. His eyes never left the child as he crouched down in front of her. His expensive suit creased slightly, but he didn't care.
Not now.
Stay with me, he said firmly, his voice dropping slightly softer. You did the right thing. You came to the right person. I'm going to take care of it. Amara didn't have the strength to respond. She just clung to him, the only man who wasn't ignoring her. Without saying another word, Min-jae stood and gave a single nod to his men. We're going up. No police. No interference. His men nodded and moved quickly, almost too smoothly, like trained soldiers. They didn't waste time, but they didn't rush either. Min-jae's presence in that space was enough to change the air, enough to make the universe hold its breath. As the elevator doors slid open to the third floor, the sounds of shouting and the unmistakable crack of flesh hitting flesh filled the narrow hallway. Min-jae's eyes narrowed. The confrontation was coming. Amara's heart was pounding in her chest, but she didn't cry. She had seen enough of the world to know that crying wasn't going to change anything. It never did. And as much as she wanted to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, she couldn't. Not when her mother was still up there. They walked down the hallway, the oppressive silence thick. The apartment door was in front of them. Amara froze. She knew what was happening inside. The shouting, the thud, the silence. It was worse than it had ever been before. Min-jae didn't knock. He didn't need to. With a single, controlled strike, he kicked the door open. The sound of wood splintering, the lock giving way, echoed through the hallway. Inside, the chaos was tangible. Furniture overturned. A lamp shattered. And in the center of it all, her mother lay on the floor, bruised, bloodied, trying to shield herself from the blows. The man standing above her, a bottle still in his hand, looked up, startled. His alcohol-smeared brain couldn't process the danger standing in the doorway. "Who the hell are you?" he slurred, his grip tightening on the bottle like it was the only weapon left. Min-jae didn't answer. He just moved. His fist connected with the man's face with brutal precision. The bottle flew from the man's hand and shattered against the wall. The man stumbled back, blood starting to pour from his nose as he gasped for breath. "You think you can hurt her?" Min-jae's voice was calm, devoid of any emotion, but it held the weight of his reputation. "You think you can harm a woman like this in front of me?" The man didn't get a chance to reply. Min-jae moved in again, his strikes faster than anyone could react. 1, 2, 3 punches, each one landing harder than the last. "Stop." The man gasped, but Min-jae didn't stop. The world around him was silent, the violence unfolding in a slow, brutal dance of power and retribution. Amara stood frozen in the doorway, unable to look away from the scene before her. She had never seen anything like it. This was the man who would save them, but she didn't know if she could trust him. She didn't know if anyone could. But he was here now. And maybe, just maybe, he was the answer. Min-jae finished with the man on the floor, his body limp, barely conscious. His gaze shifted to Amara, the weight of the violence hanging in the air between them. "Stay close to me," he said. "We're going to get you and your mother out of here." As the man lay there, defeated, Min-jae's men moved into the apartment with clinical precision. They were not here to play games. They were here to fix a mistake that had been made a long time ago. And no one was going to walk away from this without paying the price. The world outside would continue to spin, unaware of the moment that was unfolding in this crumbling apartment. But for Amara, her life had just changed forever. The man who had terrorized her and her mother was finished. But now, a new chapter began. One she didn't understand. One that she wasn't sure she wanted to be a part of. The silence that followed was more deafening than the violence. In the midst of the destruction, Amara's small form remained rigid, still clutching the fabric of Min-jae's expensive suit as he towered over the unconscious man on the floor. She stared at the man's crumpled body, her wide eyes filled with both confusion and something more, something deeper that even a 6-year-old couldn't fully understand. It was fear, sure, but also a strange sense of safety. The kind of safety you only get when you realize that someone, for once, isn't going to walk away. Her mother was still lying on the floor, barely moving, her face swollen from the brutal beating. She had been trying to shield herself, but the damage was clear. Min-jae's men had already moved in, efficiently, without a word. They were quick but thorough, their training making them a blur of motion as they handled the situation with practiced professionalism. A few were already checking the apartment for weapons, others were tending to Amara's mother, trying to stop the bleeding, making sure she was stable enough to move. Amara didn't know who to watch, her gaze flickering from her mother's unconscious body to the chaos that still unfolded around her. One of the men knelt beside her mother, a medical kit in hand, working fast to assess her condition. Another moved with cold precision, closing windows, ensuring no one could have witnessed what had just happened. Everything was being calculated. Everything was controlled. Min-jae crouched down slowly, his movements smooth, his dark eyes focused on the little girl standing frozen before him. He was like a statue in a museum, precise, deliberate, and unyielding. There was nothing soft about him. His suit was still immaculate, the expensive wool now stained with the dirt and blood from the fight, but he didn't seem to care. His eyes met Amara's, and for a moment, he didn't speak. He just studied her, taking in the sight of the little girl who had somehow found the courage to run to him for help. "You did well," he said quietly, his voice colder than she had expected. You didn't run to anyone. You came to the right person. His words were calm, measured, but they hung in the air like a heavy weight. Amara didn't say anything. She didn't know how to respond. She just nodded once, her small hand still gripping his jacket, as if it was the only thing that kept her from collapsing. The room seemed to grow smaller, the air thick with unspoken thoughts, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Min-jae straightened up and looked over at his men, his gaze hardening. Get them both out of here. Now. His words were an order, and his men moved instantly, no hesitation in their actions. One of them rushed to the unconscious man on the floor, while another started preparing the apartment for a quick exit. Amara didn't understand the urgency, but she could feel it. She had been in enough situations to know when things were about to get complicated. She followed Min-jae as he walked toward the door, his heavy footsteps echoing in the silence. She wanted to ask questions. Why was he helping them? What would happen now? But she didn't. She stayed quiet, her small hands wrapped around his jacket like it was her last lifeline. They made it to the elevator without a word being spoken. Min-jae's men had already cleared the path, ensuring no one would see them leave. The elevator ride was short, the soft hum of the motor, the only sound. But Amara couldn't ignore the pounding in her chest, the fear that was bubbling up again as they reached the ground floor. She had no idea where they were going or what was going to happen next. But for the first time in her young life, she didn't feel like she was in danger. Min-jae's presence, cold, calculated, and commanding, made her feel like she was protected, like she wasn't just a little girl in a world full of monsters. For once, she was safe. The moment the elevator doors opened, they were met by another set of Min-jae's men, who quickly ushered them out of the building and into the waiting black sedans parked out front. The air outside was colder than it had been earlier, the city lights flickering against the dark sky. The cars were sleek, high-end, and almost too quiet as they glided through the streets. Amara sat between her mother and Min-jae, still clutching the expensive jacket wrapped around her shoulders. Zephra, still unconscious, was gently placed in a car, one of the men carefully ensuring she was comfortable as they sped off into the night. Min-jae was in the front seat, his gaze directed forward, seemingly unaffected by the chaos they had just left behind. The world outside was oblivious to the scene that had just taken place, and Amara couldn't help but feel like she was in some kind of twisted dream. The drive felt like it lasted forever. Amara's small body was exhausted, her eyes heavy as she leaned against the cool leather of the car's interior. She didn't know where they were going. She didn't know how her mother would be. But she couldn't stop herself from feeling just a bit safer. For the first time in a long time, she felt like someone cared. After what felt like hours, the car pulled into a large, secure building. The gates opened smoothly, and the car entered without question, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Amara didn't ask where they were. She didn't care. She just wanted to be sure her mother was okay. Min-jae didn't wait for anyone to open the door for him. He stepped out first, his movements smooth and controlled. One of his men was already on the phone, talking in hushed tones, but Min-jae paid no attention. His gaze shifted to Amara's mother, still unconscious and cradled carefully by two of his men. Get her inside, Min-jae ordered, his voice never wavering. We'll deal with her later. Amara was led into the building, her eyes scanning the space. It was modern, expensive, and heavily guarded. She had no idea where she was, but she didn't feel the same overwhelming terror that had gripped her earlier. Not yet, at least. Inside, the walls were lined with dark wood, polished floors that gleamed in the low light. It was almost too quiet. She felt out of place in the calm, but she didn't complain. She had learned long ago that complaining didn't change anything. It just made things worse. Zephra was quickly moved into a room, and a doctor arrived shortly after. Min-jae didn't follow them in. He stayed outside, as if everything happening around him was just another job. Amara watched him for a long moment, trying to understand the man who had saved her. There was no warmth in his eyes. No kindness. Just a cold, controlled precision that made him who he was. Why did you help us? Amara asked, her voice small but steady. Min-jae glanced down at her, his expression unreadable. I didn't do it for you, he replied. I did it because I owe someone. And when you owe, you pay your debts. Amara didn't know what that meant. She didn't know who he owed or why he had helped them. But she did know one thing. She was no longer alone. She wasn't sure what this man was capable of, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she wasn't helpless anymore. Stay here, Min-jae said, turning to leave. You'll be safe. He left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Amara was left in the sterile quiet of the room, her heart still racing as she tried to process everything that had just happened. And in that moment, she knew one thing for sure. Her life would never be the same again. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the lights overhead and the distant sound of a door closing somewhere down the hall. Amara sat still in the corner, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was watching her mother, Zephra, lying unconscious on the bed. The sight of her mother's bruised and battered face made her stomach twist. Zephra had always been strong, the kind of woman who never showed weakness, but now she lay there broken, a shell of the mother Amara had known. Min-jae hadn't told her what was happening. The men who had moved them into the building, the cold precision with which they handled everything, it was all a blur to her. She was too exhausted, too shaken, to focus on anything else. The only thing she could think about was her mom. How could a man like the one she had just seen, the one who had hurt her mother, think he could get away with it? The minutes dragged on, turning into an hour, maybe more. Amara had lost track of time. Her world had narrowed down to the small, sterile room where her mother rested and the man who had promised to keep them safe. But Amara wasn't sure what safe meant anymore. She didn't trust anyone easily, least of all men like Min-jae. There was something about him, something in his eyes, that made her uneasy. He wasn't like the people she had known before. He wasn't like the people who had hurt them. He was different, darker, and the uncertainty about him left a bitter taste in her mouth. But still, she had to admit, he had done something no one else had. He had shown up. He had stepped in. He had saved them when no one else would. That wasn't something she could ignore. Amara's mind was racing, processing everything that had happened in the last few hours. She couldn't understand it all, not yet. What was this place? Who was Min-jae, really? Why had he chosen to help them? There had to be something more to it than just paying a debt. That couldn't be the full story. As her mind continued to swirl with questions, the door to the room creaked open. Min-jae stepped inside, his tall, imposing figure filling the doorway. He looked every bit the Mafia boss, powerful, controlled, and untouchable. His expensive suit was perfectly tailored, his eyes cold and calculating as always, but something about his expression seemed to have softened just a little. He didn't look at her directly, but instead turned his gaze to Zephra, who was still unconscious in the bed. How is she? Min-jae asked, his voice low and calm, as if he were speaking about a business transaction and not the well-being of a woman he had just saved. Amara didn't answer him right away. She just stared at him, trying to make sense of the man standing before her. She wanted to ask why he cared, why he had done what he did, but she didn't. Instead, she just nodded toward her mother. She'll be okay, Min-jae said, his tone steady. Dr. Yun's treatment should help her stabilize.
But she needs rest.
A lot of it. Why did you help us? Amara blurted out, the question that had been gnawing at her finally escaping her lips. She hadn't intended to ask it, but the words tumbled out before she could stop them. Min-jae's gaze shifted to her. His eyes were dark, unreadable, as if he was weighing his response. He didn't seem angry, though. He didn't even seem surprised. He just looked at her with a kind of quiet intensity that made her feel like she was being measured. I told you, he said after a long pause. I owed someone. Amara furrowed her brow, confused. Owed someone? You don't owe us anything. Min-jae didn't smile. He didn't seem like a man who would smile, but there was something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place, that made her feel like he understood what she meant. I don't owe you, he said. But I owe the people who helped me when I needed it, the ones who gave me a chance when I was nothing. And I don't forget debts. I didn't save you to make myself feel good. I saved you because I can. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was nothing else. Just the weight of the silence between them. Amara didn't know how to respond. She didn't know if she was supposed to thank him, or ask for more, or simply accept what had happened. Min-jae stood there for a moment longer, watching her, as if waiting for her to say something. But Amara didn't have anything to say. She just stared at him, trying to figure out what kind of man could do what he had done. Finally, he sighed and moved toward the door. He turned back before leaving, his eyes catching hers once more. I don't need gratitude, Amara, he said quietly. What I need is for you to understand that you owe nothing. You don't owe me. You don't owe anyone. You just owe yourself the chance to get out of this alive. And with that, he left. The door clicked softly behind him, and Amara was left alone in the room with her mother, the weight of his words sinking in. She wasn't sure what that meant. She wasn't sure what any of this meant. But she did know one thing. Her world had changed in a way she couldn't undo. Time passed, and Amara's mother began to stir. Zephra's eyelids fluttered as she regained consciousness, her face scrunching with confusion as she tried to make sense of where she was. Mom, Amara whispered, her voice shaky. Zephra's eyes snapped open, her gaze darting around the room before landing on her daughter. The look of recognition, of relief, filled her face. Amara, she breathed, her voice hoarse. Where are we? You're safe, Amara said, her voice steadier than she felt. We're safe. We're out of there. Zephra blinked, still processing. But how? Who? Amara hesitated before speaking again. Min-jae. He saved us. Zephra's expression hardened at the mention of the man's name. She tried to sit up, but winced in pain, her hand clutching her ribs. Min-jae? The Korean Mafia boss? She whispered, as if the name alone could shatter everything. Yes, Amara said quietly.
He came.
He didn't let him hurt you anymore. He took us away. For a long time, there was only silence in the room. Zephra looked at her daughter, trying to understand. She wasn't sure if she was thankful for the help or if she should be scared of the man who had given it. We owe him nothing, Zephra finally said, her voice firm, but still weakened by the pain. You understand? We're not involved with him. Amara nodded, though she wasn't sure what the future would hold. I understand, she said softly. But part of her still didn't. She didn't understand Min-jae, his world, or the way he had come to her rescue. For now, all she could do was wait. Wait for her mother to heal, wait for the world to stop spinning, and wait for the next decision that would change everything. But somewhere deep inside her, she knew the world would never be the same again. The days blurred together in a haze of sterile rooms, guarded entrances, and whispered conversations. For the first time in what felt like forever, Amara found herself in a place that wasn't defined by fear. It wasn't home and it wasn't normal, but it was safe. For now. The safe house in Gangnam was everything Amara had never known. The soft hum of the building's air conditioning, the polished marble floors, the quiet security that lingered just beneath the surface. It felt like a world apart from everything she had left behind. But it also felt like a cage. A gilded one, maybe, but a cage all the same. Zephra had been sleeping a lot. Her body was healing, slowly, but there was still a weariness about her that refused to lift. Amara watched her mother from the doorway of their new room, her eyes tracing the lines of fatigue on Zephra's face. She was scared, but she wasn't sure what she was scared of. Was it the people who had hurt them? Was it the life they had left behind? Or was it the quiet promises that Min-jae had made, the ones that had tangled them up in a world they didn't understand? Amara couldn't help but wonder about the man who had saved them. He wasn't like anyone she had ever known. He was different from the criminals she'd seen on the streets, different from the men who had hurt her mother. There was something unsettling about him, his calmness, his control, the way he moved like he was always 3 steps ahead. He wasn't a good man. Amara knew that. But he wasn't bad either. She didn't know if she could trust him. But the fact that he was still watching over them, that he hadn't turned them away, made her feel like there was still hope. And yet, part of her wanted to run. to take her mother and leave, to find a place where they could start over without owing anyone anything. But she also knew that was impossible. Min Jae had made sure they understood the stakes. He had promised them protection, but that protection came at a cost. A cost that Amara wasn't sure she was ready to pay. It was the middle of the afternoon when the knock came at the door. Amara was sitting by the window, watching the traffic below, her mind racing as usual. She wasn't expecting visitors, but in a place like this, nothing was ever truly unexpected. Zephyr stirred on the bed, rubbing her eyes, her face still pale from the injuries she had suffered. She glanced at the door and then at Amara, her expression wary. "I'll get it," Amara said, standing up before her mother could say anything. There was something in her gut, a warning, an intuition that told her this visit was different. She walked to the door, her small hands shaking as she turned the handle. When she opened it, she wasn't surprised to find Min Jae standing in the hallway. But there was something different about him today. His suit was blacker than usual, the edges of his collar sharp and neat, but his eyes, they were sharper. There was an intensity there that made her stomach tighten. He wasn't here for pleasantries. He was here for business. "Amara," he greeted her, his voice calm as ever. "Is your mother awake?" Amara nodded, stepping aside to let him in. She didn't know if she should feel relief or fear. Min Jae wasn't someone you could read easily. He was like a predator in a room full of prey, always in control, always calculating. Zephyr was sitting up now, rubbing her sore ribs. Her eyes met Min Jae's as he stepped into the room, his presence filling the space. There was a moment of silence before she spoke, her voice still strained from the beating. "What do you want from us?" she asked, her tone flat but firm. Min Jae's eyes flicked to her, then to Amara, before he spoke. "Nothing from you. Not yet." Zephyr's brow furrowed. "Then why are we here?" "Because you're safe," Min Jae replied. "And I'm keeping my promise. But things are changing, and you need to be prepared." Amara's pulse quickened at the mention of change. "What kind of changes?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Min Jae didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his attention to the window, his posture relaxed, but his eyes scanning the street below with a familiarity that sent a shiver down Amara's spine. "Things are more complicated than you realize," he said after a long moment, his voice low and steady. "The men who hurt you, they weren't just criminals. They were part of something bigger. Something you don't want to be involved in." Zephyr's gaze sharpened. "What are you talking about?" "The Russians," Min Jae replied, his voice colder now. "The Bratva. They're not just pushing drugs and guns. They're moving people, women, children. And they've been using your ex-boyfriend as a pawn in their game. His betrayal isn't just about you. It's about a network of criminals who've been running operations across Asia and Europe for years." Amara's stomach dropped. The Bratva? She had heard the name before, whispered in dark corners. But she had never imagined it would come this close to her. Min Jae turned back toward Zephyr, his eyes piercing. "Your ex-boyfriend. He wasn't just a man who beat you. He was a cog in a much larger machine. And that machine is now after both of you." Amara's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't breathe. Everything had been spinning so fast, and now it was like the world had come crashing down on them. "Are you saying they'll come for us?" Zephyr's voice was low, but Amara could hear the fear beneath it. Min Jae's expression didn't waver. "They already have." The weight of his words hung in the air like smoke. Amara could feel her legs start to shake beneath her. The room, once so secure, now felt suffocating. She wanted to run. She wanted to disappear into the world outside, where none of this could touch her, but she knew it wouldn't work. Not now. Not anymore. "We need to move," Min Jae continued, his gaze never leaving them. "I've arranged for you to go somewhere safe, where you'll be protected. But you need to trust me. You need to follow my orders, no questions asked. If you don't..." He let the silence stretch between them, the threat hanging unspoken in the air. Zephyr looked at Amara, her eyes filled with the kind of decision only a mother could make. "I trust you," she said finally, though her voice trembled. "But I need to know this isn't just a game to you. That you're not just protecting us for some reason I don't understand. Min-jae gave a sharp nod. I'm not a good man, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. But I'm not your enemy. I'm doing this because I don't let people I protect get hurt. And because I made a promise. That was all Zephyr needed to hear. Without another word, she nodded in agreement. For the first time since they had arrived in this strange new world, Amara felt something inside her stir. It wasn't hope, not yet. But it was something. Something that told her maybe, just maybe, they had a chance at surviving this. Min-jae turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing softly. Pack your things, he said over his shoulder. We leave in an hour. Amara and her mother exchanged one last look, neither of them knowing what would happen next. The story was far from over, but this moment, this decision, would mark the beginning of something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The silence in the penthouse was deafening. The calm before the storm, the kind of stillness that always preceded chaos. Amara stood by the window, her small fingers pressed against the cool glass, watching as Seoul stretched out beneath her. It was the kind of view people only dreamed of, but for her it felt more like a prison. The lights twinkled like 1,000 stars, but there was no peace to be found in the beauty of the city. Not when everything around her was about to change forever. Zephyr sat at the table, her hands trembling slightly as she stirred her coffee. The bruises on her face were fading, but the wariness in her eyes hadn't gone away. She was healing physically, but emotionally, she was still a million miles away from the woman she used to be. And Amara, despite everything that had happened, was starting to feel the same way. They weren't free. Not yet. They had been given a temporary reprieve, but Amara knew that nothing in Min-jae's world came without a price. Min-jae was seated across from them, his presence as commanding as ever. His sharp suit, expensive watch, and controlled demeanor made him seem untouchable, a man who existed in a world of power and shadows. But now, there was something different in his eyes. Something that suggested he was no longer just a player in that world. He was about to burn it all down, and he was going to make sure that nobody, not even the ones who had helped him rise to the top, could stand in his way. Amara couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this conversation, was a turning point. For her mother, for Min-jae, and for the city they were all trapped in. I've made arrangements, Min-jae said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. The quiet intensity was unmistakable. Tomorrow we strike. Amara's stomach churned. Strike? She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Who are you striking? Min-jae's eyes flicked to her, his gaze unreadable. The Bratva, he said, his voice still controlled, but there was something in his tone that made her blood run cold. And anyone else who thinks they can hurt you. Or anyone else who thinks they can threaten the people I care about. Zephyr looked up at him, her expression skeptical, but not surprised. She had already begun to suspect the kind of man Min-jae was. The kind of man who did things that couldn't be undone. The kind of man who built his empire on violence and blood. You can't just take on the Bratva, she said quietly. This isn't some small-time operation. You don't just wake up one day and say, I'm going to destroy them. Min-jae's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. I don't just wake up one day. I've been planning this for a long time. The Bratva thinks they can operate without consequences. They think they can use people like you as pawns in their game. But they've made a mistake. And I'm going to make them pay. Amara's mind raced. But you're not the good guy, are you? She blurted out. You're not a hero. You don't save people just to be nice. You do it because it benefits you. Min-jae didn't flinch. He simply watched her with a steady gaze. I never said I was a hero, he replied, his voice low and cold. But that doesn't mean I can't do something good once in a while. I'm not trying to be good, Amara. I'm trying to be something else. Something that gets results. Amara looked down at the floor, unsure how to feel. She couldn't decide if she should thank him for saving them or resent him for making them part of his world. He had given them safety, but that safety came at a cost they hadn't fully understood yet. Zephyr leaned forward, her voice steady, but filled with concern. How many people are going to get hurt in all of this? How many lives are going to be destroyed because of your decisions? Min Jae's eyes flicked to her. I've already made my peace with that, he said flatly. You can't change the world without breaking something first. Sometimes, people have to pay the price for the greater good. That's the excuse of every criminal, Zephyr shot back, her voice sharp. And what happens when you destroy everyone else's lives for the sake of your empire? What happens when it's over and you're left alone? Min Jae didn't answer. Instead, he stood up, moving toward the window. The city outside seemed so far away now, so distant. He had already made his choice. There was no going back for him. There was only the fight ahead. You don't understand, he said softly, almost to himself. I don't have the luxury of regret. I've fought my way to the top, and I'm not going to let anyone take that away from me. Not again. Amara could feel the tension in the room tightening, and she wasn't sure if she was afraid of Min Jae or of what he was going to do next. He had promised to protect them, but now she was starting to understand the true weight of that protection. It wasn't just about keeping them safe from the Bratva. It was about keeping them in his world. A world that demanded loyalty, obedience, and, sometimes, blood. Min Jae turned back to face them, his eyes cold and calculating. I'm giving you both a choice, he said, his voice commanding. You can stay here, in safety, and live the life I've given you. Or you can walk away and take your chances in a world that will never forget what happened to you. Zephyr's expression hardened, her protective instincts kicking in. We don't owe you anything, she said firmly. You gave us protection, but we never asked for this. We never asked for you to make decisions for us. Min Jae's lips tightened, but he didn't argue. I'm not asking for anything, he said quietly. I'm giving you a chance. But you'll have to decide if you want to take it. There was a long pause as the three of them sat in the silence, the weight of Min Jae's words hanging heavily in the air. Amara looked at her mother, then back at Min Jae. She knew this was a turning point, the moment when everything could change. She wasn't sure if they were doing the right thing by trusting him, or if they were just trading one kind of cage for another. But in that moment, Amara made a decision. She stood up, her voice steady despite the uncertainty that clawed at her insides. We'll stay, she said, her eyes locked on Min Jae. But only if you promise us one thing. If you're going to make us part of this, you're going to make sure we're never the ones who are left behind. Min Jae studied her for a long time, as if weighing the sincerity of her words. Finally, he nodded, his expression softening just a little. I can promise you that, he said. But remember, the world doesn't owe you anything. And sometimes, the only way to survive is to make sure you don't become a liability. Zephyr stood up, placing a hand on Amara's shoulder. Then we're in this together, she said quietly, her voice filled with both determination and uncertainty. We'll survive this, but we won't be your pawns. Min Jae nodded. Fair enough, he said. We all have our roles to play. And with that, the door closed behind him, leaving Amara and her mother alone in the silence of the penthouse. Outside, the city stretched out before them, glittering with the promise of both danger and opportunity. Amara took a deep breath and turned back to her mother. What now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Zephyr didn't answer right away. She simply pulled Amara into her arms, holding her close as they both stood there in the dim light. They didn't know what would come next. They didn't know what the future held. But for the first time in a long time, they felt like they might have a chance. The end.